In this video I'll explain what extreme or negative cases are and why it's important to analyze them. So firstly, what are negative or extreme cases? Sometimes also referred to as deviant cases or even as outliers, although this term is more reserved to quantitative research. These extreme or negative cases are basically something that does not match the rest of your data. So usually as you are analyzing your data, you are beginning to develop some kind of a theory or explanation of what's happening in the data, or maybe a working hypothesis. And then you come across this one case or this one person, usually, whose views or attitudes or whatever that she said does not really match this emerging explanation. So you may be tempted to just ignore that account or that person, or maybe omit that from your findings because you have worked so hard to develop that theory or explanation, and now you come across somebody whose views are completely different. However, I would like to urge you not to omit that person or not to ignore that finding, but instead to focus hard on analyzing what that person has said, or maybe analyzing some characteristics or demographic characteristics of that person, because contrary to what it may feel initially, this extreme case is not going to ruin your theory, but usually will actually enrich it. Quite often when you start focusing on that extreme or negative case, and then going back to the rest of your participants as well, so basically trying to understand where the difference comes from, usually what happens is that you begin to see things that you didn't see initially. And also what happens is that by understanding where the difference lies, or what's the source of the difference between that one person and the rest of your participants, doing so usually highlights the similarities between the rest of the participants. So highlights some kind of a quality or experience or something that they all have in common. So as I said, it strengthens your explanation and basically provides you much more insight into it. So imagine, for example, that you're conducting a study in which you are exploring men's views of and knowledge about football. So you have 15 participants, and as you are progressing through your data analysis, you are developing this theory that those men who were exposed to football at home, so their parents, for example, watched football, those men develop interest in football. Of course, this is just an example, so it may sound silly, but this is just to demonstrate what I mean. So you have this working theory, and it seems to work for 14 of your participants. But then you come across this final participant, and it seems that everything is ruined basically, because this participant was exposed to football at home, and yet he doesn't like football and he doesn't know much about football. So it seems like you can just throw away the whole theory that you worked so hard to develop. But then, because you really want to understand what's happening here, you start rereading that person's accounts, and then going back to the rest of the participants' accounts and maybe comparing some demographic characteristics. So basically you want to see what happened, why this person doesn't like football despite having been exposed to it in childhood. And then you realize that this person's exposure was actually very short. So for example, he was only exposed to football for 1 year, and then you go back to the rest of the participants, and then you realize that they were exposed to football for much longer than that. So for example, throughout the whole childhood. So your theory is still correct, and it's actually more precise now, because now you can add to it that those who were exposed to football in childhood for, let's say, longer than 1 year, or longer than 5 years, or for at least 6 years, those people develop interest in football and maybe knowledge of football. So again, as I said, this is just a silly example, of course, but I hope that you understand my point. So by analyzing, by looking at that one extreme case, you actually understood much more what the rest of the participants had in common. So you kind of knew is that exposure to football, but you didn't think about the length of that exposure. And then you found that negative case, and only then did you focus on considering how long that exposure needs to be. There are many other things that you can do when you're analyzing negative cases, and so many other ways in which this kind of analysis may benefit your findings, but in all cases it helps you develop a better understanding of your data, because you are kind of forced to go back to your data and really think carefully about that explanation that you had. If you want to know more about comparing different participants' views and basically what to compare and how to do that, so the process known as cross-case comparisons or cross-case analysis, I strongly recommend my self-study course on how to analyze qualitative data. I'll put the link in the description. So basically in that course I go through the whole process of data analysis step by step and in order that usually I implement when I conduct data analysis. So I focus on making initial notes and observations, on developing working models and hypotheses. Then of course I talk about coding, and I share two techniques that I usually employ when I do my coding. Then I explain what happens after the coding. So coding is not the final product of data analysis, it's just the beginning or maybe the middle. But it's not the final product. So I explain what happens after the coding. So that's when I explain cross-case comparisons and also within-case comparisons or within-case analysis. So analyzing one particular case before you start comparing that case to the rest of your participants. And then I talk about developing a theory or explanation that unifies the whole data set. So unifies everything that you have developed so far. So as I said, if you're interested in qualitative data analysis and in how I usually do it step by step, I cover all this in that course on how to analyze qualitative data. Finally, if you enjoyed watching this, like the video, and if you're new to this channel, consider subscribing. Also feel free to post your questions in comments and let me know if you've ever come across negative cases in your qualitative data analysis.